Russian crude oil prices have dropped to their lowest level since 2022. US is preparing another round of crippling sanctions to put Moscow's war economy to its knees. Meanwhile, US is ready to provide Ukraine with Article 5-like security guarantee. How does Putin's economy feel right now, and what could face Moscow next? Russian crude oil prices have dropped to their lowest level since Moscow launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, as mounting Western pressure forces exporters to offer steep discounts, according to Bloomberg. Data cited by Bloomberg from industry pricing agency Argus Media shows that Russian crude shipped from key export hubs in Black Sea, the Black Sea and the Pacific port of Kozmino, is now selling for just over $40 a barrel. That marks a decline of roughly 28% compared with average prices over the past 3 months, and represents the weakest pricing for Russian oil since the war began. The sharp fall underscores the growing impact of Western sanctions and enforcement efforts aimed at curbing Kremlin's oil revenues, a critical source of funding for the Russian state. Expanded restrictions on shipping, insurance and financial services have increased the risks and costs associated with moving Russian crude oil, forcing sellers to accept deeper discounts to attract buyers. Bloomberg reports that recent sanctions targeting major Russian energy companies and entities involved in oil transportation have further tightened the market for Russian barrels. As a result, traders and refiners demand lower prices to compensate for logistical hurdles and potential risks. The pressure comes as global oil markets are also weakening. Brent crude, the international benchmark, has fallen below $60 a barrel, amplifying the revenue hit for Russian exporters by lowering the baseline from which discounts are calculated. Despite continued exports, primarily to buyers in Asia, India, China, Russian ability to profit from oil sales has been significantly reduced. Sanctions have complicated shipping routes and payments, while some refineries face difficulties processing Russian crude under tightening sanctions. Oil and gas revenues account for roughly a quarter of Russia's federal budget, making the decline in prices and export income a growing concern for Russia. Bloomberg notes that sustained low prices could further strain government finances at a time when military and social spending remains elevated. The latest pricing data highlights how Western efforts are increasingly taking effect, even as the country continues to move large volumes of oil onto global markets, according to Bloomberg. Meanwhile, US is preparing a new package of sanctions targeting Russia if Vladimir Putin rejects a new offer of peace by the West, according to Bloomberg. The potential measures would focus largely on Russia's energy sector, including vessels used to transport crude oil and intermediates involved in selling Russian barrels abroad. Sanctions are designed to tighten pressure on Moscow by restricting one of its most important sources of revenue. People familiar with the discussions told Bloomberg that the new penalties could be announced as soon as this week, depending on how diplomatic talks progress. The effort is part of broader US strategy to use economic leverage to push Kremlin toward negotiating settlement. Bloomberg reported that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had discussed the sanctions with European allies in recent days, signaling close coordination with the US. However, officials stressed that any final decision would rest with President Donald Trump. The measures under consideration include additional restrictions on Russia's so-called shadow fleet, a network of tankers used to move oil while avoiding existing sanctions, as well as traders and companies that help facilitate those shipments, Bloomberg told. The threat of new sanctions comes as US, European, Ukrainian officials continue to explore outlines for a possible peace deal. So major obstacles remain, including territorial issues and security guarantees. News of potential sanctions briefly lifted oil prices as markets weighting the risk for tighter controls on Russian crude oil. Russia remains one of the world's largest oil exporters, and energy revenues account for a significant share of its budget. Bloomberg noted that the proposed measures would build on existing US and allied sanctions imposed since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, reflecting Washington's continued reliance on economic pressure as key tool in its approach to the war. US and European officials have drawn up a plan that also would strengthen Ukraine's military and provide long-term Western backing if a peace deal with Russia is reached, according to Bloomberg. The proposal centers on building a much larger and more capable Ukrainian armed forces supported by military, intel, finance. The goal is to deter any future Russian aggression and ensure Ukraine can defend itself after a ceasefire or a peaceful settlement, according to Bloomberg sources. Under one draft of the plan, Ukraine would maintain a peacetime force of 800,000 troops, far larger than most European armies, reflecting lessons learned from Russia's invasion and the need for a strong deterrent. The plan envisions years of training, equipment upgrades, and operational support from Western partners. The proposal also includes a role for European countries, with discussions underway about deploying a multinational European-led force in Western Ukraine, well away from the front lines. According to Bloomberg, the force would focus on air and maritime security, training, logistical support, rather than direct combat operations. US involvement would extend beyond weapons deliveries. Bloomberg reported that Washington would provide expanded intel sharing, surveillance, and early warning support to help Ukraine detect and respond quickly to any renewed Russian build-up or covert operations. While the proposals stop short of offering NATO membership, they are designed to give Ukraine security guarantees strong enough to discourage future attacks, according to Bloomberg. Key details, including troop numbers for European forces, timelines, and binding legal commitments, remain under negotiation. The planning comes as Western governments weigh how to balance pressure on Moscow with diplomatic efforts to end the war, amid concerns that any settlement lacking robust security guarantee could leave Ukraine vulnerable and weak. Meanwhile, the US has also offered Ukraine security guarantees modeled on Article 5, like mutual defense clause, but the offer is limited in time, according to Politico. US officials involved in the talks told Politico that Washington is prepared to provide Kyiv with assurances that would treat a future attack on Ukraine as a matter of collective security, even though Ukraine would not become a member of NATO. The guarantees are intended to reassure Ukraine and deter Russia if a peace deal is reached. However, Politico reported that US negotiators have made clear the proposal is not open-ended. Ukraine has been given a narrow window to accept the terms. American officials signaling that the strongest versions of the guarantees is available now and may be withdrawn. According to Politico, the guarantees could be legally binding and may require approval from US Congress, giving them more weight than past political pledges. Still, they would fall short of full membership in NATO, which remains a red line for some US allies and major demand from Ukraine. That's all for today. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, and glory to Ukraine.